Sure.
Jones.
Yeah, Jones possibly, but those guys aren't Prongers or Niedermeyers or Stevens or like guys like of that status, Duncan Keith, like Zdeno Chara, like they're for a long time. Hedman in Tampa, like you needed a stud 30-minute number one guy. That guy doesn't exist in Toronto, but with that in mind, do you think they can have visions of a Stanley Cup with their current defense setup?
Well, I think that's the million-dollar question. I think they have good pieces. It's how they defend, how they play. Like Morgan Rielly, for as good a skater as he is, he does not hold the blue line very well. He backs in. With his skating ability, he should be holding the red line, let alone the blue line, and challenging players to dump the puck, challenging players. And whether that's a system, whether that's his just inability to do it, I don't know, but I look at just their current makeup. They're pretty big on the right side with Tanev, Carlo. You got Benoit,
Ekman Larson,
yeah. So you got some size, you got some mobility, decent puck movers. They're not great puck movers in Tanev and Carlo, but they're serviceable, and that's when you got to pair them with the appropriate player on the other side. You get a McCabe, you get a Riley, and then whether it's Benoit or whoever's on that other side on the left, the third pairing, whether it's OEL or Benoit, you have to have a yin and a yang. When you don't have a true number one, you've got to have a lot of balance between your top six defensemen, and I think they can have that. I just don't think they've been able to put it all together. And as we talk about what Toronto did against Florida, there were moments where they played really, really well. And then there were other times where they were putrid and just not good at all. And you just wonder how there's such a wide gap and a big delta between when they're good and when they're not. And I think that's the biggest thing that they have to put their finger on is why is there such a big gap between how good they play and how bad they play?
So, Prongs, if this team isn't going to look a lot different, if they end up bringing Tavares back, you mentioned the Mitch Marner hole. Is it better served to take that, we'll call it $12 million, whatever it is, $11 million, and sprinkle it out a little bit more depth up front, one or two guys that can score, or do you go chasing a guy like a Marchand or a Bennett that could be a difference maker if they're available? Again, this is wishful thinking, but do you go chasing those guys, or do you look for three guys that could create a little bit more balance farther down in your lineup?
Well, I think that's the $64 million question. What are they going to do with that money, and how do they spend it? But I think, to your point earlier, they have to spend it wisely. They've been up against the cap for so many years. They haven't had any flexibility. They've now traded a lot of their draft capital in order to get the current formation of the team. What makes sense? You bring up Brad Marchand. Is he going to be the same player in a top six role versus a third line role like he was in Florida? I personally don't think he will be. He's going to be playing against top four defensemen instead of the third pairing. He's going to be playing against, just from a matchup perspective, it was a perfect matchup for him playing on Florida's third line. And he was playing with two great, really good players in Lundell and Luostarinen. And the way that they played, the system, the turnovers that their defense created by having their tight gaps and how physical they played, it just fit him perfectly. I don't know if Toronto would be a great fit in that sense, and what you're going to have to pay him to get him to want to come there. And that becomes the trick. Are you overpaying a guy, and then does he actually fit what you're trying to do, versus is he just a name and has shown to be a leaf killer in this case? I'm not sure, but I think they have to be very careful in what they do with that money, knowing that next year it's going to go up again, and the following year it's going to go up again. So they're going to have some breathing room, but they're also going to have players coming up too.
Prongs, we were talking earlier about all these GMs that think they want to be buyers and that their team's just a couple players to kind of turn in the corner. Like, I find it personally laughable, and I think there's a large percentage of teams that are a bunch of jokesters because their teams they're just nowhere close. Like, where do you stand on all these teams or a bunch of them thinking that they're just one thing away or this away, when in actuality they ain't close to squat?
Well, especially when you compare them to the teams that were in the Stanley Cup final. You know, you got Edmonton with 2 superstars in the National Hockey League. You've got Florida with a complete depth team. They have star players, but they're deep throughout the core of their lineup. You know, and I go back to Chicago in picking up Marian Hossa. He was the last piece of the puzzle. When they got him in free agency, that was the missing piece to what they needed to win. All the other pieces were in place. And for a lot of teams, I think they're seeing, well, we've got room in the cap finally. We've got, you know, they have higher expectations or a higher view of their current players, their current roster. It's GM selling their owner that they think they're close and they want to spend a little bit more money. But I think if you look at the playoffs this year, you look at a few of the teams that didn't make the playoffs that think they're playoff contenders next year. Playoff contending and Stanley Cup contending are 2 different things. And if you're going to go out and spend a ton of money and think that you're going to be a Stanley Cup contender, all you got to do is just look at the rosters of those that are in that upper echelon, and you're going to realize real quick that you're not even close.
It's got to be that's the toughest part of the job.
But so what we're talking about is, like, imagine tricking yourself into thinking, and we discussed earlier, a lot of guys have a lot of problems, and that's why you have to have a real quality assistant GM or a vice, you know, special assistant. Like, you got to have a guy to shake you and say, this is insane. But so many people fall in love with these dumb ideas that they have, and it's insanity. It's insanity.
Well, and they fall in love with their players because they drafted them and they've developed them, and they're unwilling to get off them. And
exactly.
Good or bad. And because they've seen them grow and develop, and they've got a connection to them, and they drafted them in the first round, and then they've, you know, had them in the minors and worked up through the system, and they've worked their way from the 3rd line to the 2nd line. Now they're star players in the National Hockey League for their respective team. And so there's a connection and an idea that they can get them to the promised land. And for some of them, as we know, they're just not at the level that these, you know, if you go back to Tampa, now Florida, teams that have won, what it actually takes and how they ultimately get over the hump to be a playoff team, to then a Stanley Cup contending team, to then being a Stanley Cup winner. There's 3 different steps there, and each one of them is extremely hard.
With Chris Pronger, and, you know, we were talking about Buffalo earlier, and they traded J.J. Peterka to Utah, and they, you know, bring in a couple of pieces. But Kevin Adams has been there for 5 years now, and they haven't sniffed the playoffs. They haven't been to the playoffs in 14 years.